Hello, everybody. Me again.
Woohoo! Layman.
The idea here is to have Gregg take me through a well-being analysis process that he's got worked out based on his very sophisticated, large-scale integrated ideas about psychology. And I think a lot of people have heard Gregg in dialogue around these ideas. And that dialogue, as fascinating and exciting as it is, can be very abstract, theoretical sounding. So I thought it would be great to see some of these ideas deployed in practice and how it actually shows up in terms of the discursive relationship between the person who's coming in with their own experience and the person who's coming in with the big map.
Lovely. Yeah. So it's a great opportunity to share this and put, the journey starts in the psychotherapy room, and it is exactly as you say, off top of the abstraction, but it is about getting back. It was originally about getting back to that. Now it's about getting back to life and doing it adaptively towards wisdom. But there's still this whole issue about what is the proper orientation in psychotherapy, or for me as a psychological doctor. Okay. So what Layman and I have agreed to do is I'm going to take him through a psychological checkup. All right. So let's talk a little bit about that. So when you go, the medical community, at least Western medicine, is reasonably well organized around physiology, biology, anatomy, and pathophysiology, the basic model. And there's the idea of the physical. Okay. And that's a general picture of somebody sort of in a normative state where we can run diagnostics and make sure they're in the normative framing where we would want them to be, so we can then stamp them as healthy. I want to check your weight. I want to check your blood pressure. I want to see if you had any pain. I want to see what you're doing in relationship to your diet, eating, exercise, etc. Potentially. Of course, that's going to blend actually over into a psychological checkup. But what would it look like if we had a psychological? And if you're in the field like I am, you know that there isn't there's what's called the clinical intake, okay, which varies tremendously. There are screens that are kind of used, how you doing, blah, 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 but there's no systematic assessment that really would give you a psychological, okay? This project emerged, what now I'm going to walk you through is sort of part of the well-being screen and checkup system, and we're going to be doing a subset of the well-being screen and checkup system, a well-being interview, okay? And the process emerged when I started to develop the unified approach to psychotherapy. I started to develop a protocol, and central to the unified approach is the building of a conceptualization of well-being and character functioning. Okay. And then it was as I then realized I needed that, I then built this system that would then segue people into the psychotherapeutic process. And it also then afforded a potential where you get a standardized view of psychological well-being. Okay. And then it was like, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if our field, like medicine has a physical, really should be called a biophysical, okay, would have a psychological, I might say now. And I think that it makes good sense. And as I told you right before we hit play, it's also like, be careful. Okay. So like, it makes good sense to do things like IQ testing at one level. And then we institutionalize IQ testing, and then talk to Zach Stein, and there's a whole bunch of potential power problems, inequities, governmental entrenchment, etc. So wherever you are on the libertarian sort of progressive government involvement structure, you're gonna angle that in a lot of different ways. And so I want to recognize that I'd be cautious, but could see some value certainly. And then the question is, if there is value, what would it look like? So that's the backdrop structure. And then Layman was like, hey, yeah, what does that look like? Curious, open guy that he is. And I was like, yeah, I'll walk you through what the hell. So that's how we got here.
How much of this do you think would be automatable? Like, how much of it could be put into an app?
A lot. I mean, definitely, if you wanted, certainly at the level of sort of if you have a situation where you have a pretty good historian, so that's the term for an individual that is relatively accurate and honest, okay, about their current state and history, and you have a therapeutic assessment alignment. What that means is your interest and my interest ally, and you want to be honest with yourself, and we want to get a broad snapshot of how you're doing. A lot of this can be done very quickly and could be done pretty in a quantitative sort of way. In fact, that's kind of there's a bridging function between a qualitative set of assessments and a quantitative set of assessments. And at a macroscopic level, a lot of it, I think, can be reduced. When I say macroscopic, if I want a variable aggregate pattern, if people generally do this, like, for example, you'll actually get a lot of information if you want variable aggregate. If you asked individuals a one question deal, which actually sort of relates to the one question that we start with, and that is, how satisfied are you with your life? Where satisfaction means have a lot of positive relative to negative emotion, you're meeting your goals, and you're feeling like you're doing well. Okay. And then imagine yourself either on a continuum, or sometimes they put it on a ladder, and each step in the ladder, rung in the ladder, goes up to 10, and ask yourself to put yourself where you are on that ladder, on your sense of overall life satisfaction. Okay. We can gain where you are on that ladder at a variable aggregate level is a very, very powerful question. In fact, there are countries, Burma or whatever, maybe, that are trying to shift their entire GDP, gross domestic product, to a global well-being product, like where they're really after, and they will use a question or a set of 3 or 4 questions like this to try to assess where the global sense of happiness, well-being, life satisfaction is. And certainly there's some validity. If you score that at a 2 versus an 8, that comes with a whole host of different kinds of structures, kind of like do an IQ. If you have a distribution IQ, you can't do self-assessment on IQ, but I could do a 20-item question and actually get a reasonable assessment of somebody's IQ, at least on a broad macro scale. And I don't want to get into details of that, but you can get a lot of early information. Now, to get into somebody at the level of their psychic life, then you need a much more detailed thing if you want a nuanced, complex, framing. I got to keep my status as happy.
Hey, yeah.
This is about, nomethetic and ideographic will be woven through virtually all of my things as a function of our last.
Stay on brand.
Exactly.
All right. So where do we start? How do we get this thing going?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the context is you're now coming in, and I'm a psychological doctor. Okay. So you're ready for your, annual or every 5-year checkup. That's our context. Okay. So you just sort of wander in and sort of like, so that's all right. We've done all the paperwork and everything. It's like, okay, so, basically we're just going to take some time. All right. And you've had a physical. Okay. They run through all that stuff. So this is a psychological. And my goal here with you is to get a sense as to how you're doing, really for you and for us to kind of know, hey, if you're flourishing, that's great. Get a clean bill of psychological health. Okay. If there are some areas of vulnerability, we can at least shine the light on some of that. Okay. If there are really areas of struggle, okay, that are either happening or close to happening, like you're getting vulnerable, then we can bring some care to that and help you understand, get a better insight, and maybe get ahead of it before it really results in any kind of collapse. And of course, if you're really struggling, we'll then know to get you some help right away. Okay.
Sure.
So what I'd like to do is just start really broadly, okay, and sort of ask you to just take a step back and reflect generally on your life, okay, and give me some sort of sense of evaluation. Put that kind of like how you feel about it, how you think it's going, on sort of and you can ask these kinds of notions like, do you consider yourself happy or sad? Do you think you're doing well? And ultimately, kind of the senses that I'd like you to reflect on is, how satisfied are you generally with your life?
I'm playing off my own cautiousness. I'm going to say pretty satisfied, but I'm aware that what I call pretty satisfied, some other people might call highly satisfied.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a different kind of, when I think about what would be more satisfying, it would be more of what I already have. So then it makes me think I'm more satisfied than I think I am. I'm just trying to leave open a lot of space for it to get even better.
Right.
If I imagine a number line, I run the dot up, it twinges at 83, but then it kind of pulses at 94.
Okay. All right. So you, if I may, you responded to that really in an interesting way. You deconstructed it a little bit, you layered it out a bit, you gave a whole bunch of, kind of complex answers. Does that reflect you? Would you just describe yourself kind of as a complex, open thinker?
I think that's pretty accurate. it's situational to some degree, right? I feel comfortable with you, and I know you can probably handle me saying those things.
Okay.
But
Right.
if I don't say them, they usually go on in, right?
Mhm.
A number of interpretive options and strategies come up on the dashboard right away,
Right.
and without
Totally.
much effort.
Mhm. Let me take a slightly different angle then. Let's talk a little bit about your felt sense of engagement. Okay. Do you feel sort of alive in the world? Do you feel engaged with it? Do you feel like there's lots of affordances for you to be engaged in the world in a positive way? Or do you feel neutral down into disengaged, apathetic, uninterested?
I don't feel disengaged. I mean, I feel very engaged in the areas where I'm engaged, but I'm also aware that there are a lot of areas where I could be more engaged in theory, but I also don't know how much of that is me and how much of that is the world. Right? You're always like, well, I am pretty engaged, but maybe my engagement should be at a bigger scale. Maybe I should be fixing all the things. Then you go, well, that's crazy. I can't. There's no levers for that. So, but I'm aware of it. That would be nice if I had broader impact, I think. But I do feel in most of the areas that I run into in my life, pretty engaged or pretty able to quickly find the areas where I would like to engage is probably a more accurate way of putting it. There's a lot of things I'm not interested in engaging at all.
Sure.
I feel no engagement, but I've gotten better over time at finding the openings for my kind of engagement.
Right. All right. So, of course, there's almost an infinite number of paths of potential engagement, and no one can be heavily engaged in all of that. You pull yourself in all these different directions. So you have to constrain. And so what I'm hearing is in the cast that do feel like when you get up in the morning, it's like, hey, there's a lot of stuff I want to do. And a lot of it gets to be realized during the day in a way that's at least reasonably engaging for you and satisfactory.
Yeah. When I get up in the morning, psychologically and like looking at my life, it's either I'm excited about some of the things I have to do today or excited that there's suddenly a free space where I don't have to do those things today.
Okay. So that's a really good indicator. So desire, excitement, enthusiasm in relationship to one's activities is indicative of real engagement, as opposed to mutedness or worse, dread, regret, concern, a felt sense of ugh, to put it in clinical terms.
I have a suspicion sometimes about, I'm like, whoa, what if my general good feeling is artificial? Like if I get up and I'm like, all right, I'm going to do a meditation, then I'm going to do yoga, right? And then I'm going to have a great relational conversation. So then I think, if I didn't do those things, then how would I feel? Maybe my life isn't as good as I think.
Right. You never know, right?
But then that's a fun suspicion. I like to have suspicions about myself.
Lovely. Okay. Let me then put this. So overall, we're going to getting this picture in relationship to this. We have this engagement picture. Talk to me a little bit about your sense of values or meaning or purpose. Those can all overlap, but it's sort of like, hey, what do you think's important? What are your beliefs, your spiritual, religious beliefs? And do you think your life's kind of aligning with those in a way that is meaningful or cultivates a sense of purpose in you?
That one's tricky. I got the image of a time when I was a kid where I went to try to find out where a rainbow comes down. You know, like you kid, you're like, people say there's probably no pot of gold, but I should probably check. But then when you get close, you can't see it anymore because now the angle of the diffraction of the light's off, right? So that's how I suspect I feel, right? Which is I feel a strong sense of value and purpose, but I think I'm close enough to it that it doesn't stand out to me. When I was younger, I think I was a little further off. I was looking to it. And so I was like, well, there it is. I'm looking for partly ultimate meaning, right? You're into this religious thing. You think there's some kind of value experience you can have that will override all possible other things. And at the same time, a lot of my actual, my lived values were very much in relationship. So those things were very clear to me. And now it seems like what I suspect is I'm very close to value and purpose and meaning because when I look around, I don't see it, but I don't suffer.
Maybe, Layman, you could say you're adjacent to it.
Yeah, I mean, right next to it somehow, if there was a word for that.
If there'd almost be like a philosophical, metaphysical schematic that you could place yourself in proper relation, that'd be great, right? And to the values of being. Okay.
I feel, yeah, my days feel meaningful, but I don't often conceptualize that as a relationship to a particular value framework the way I might have done in the past.
Okay. So if we can just sort of summarize a broad picture here, okay, what I'm feeling is that although you want to create a lot of nuance, when you do take a step back, you see your life as you're pretty satisfied with it overall. There is quite a bit of engagement, enthusiasm in the areas that you're interested in. And although it's a very complicated question in terms of meaning, purpose, and values, you do situate yourself and make sense out of yourself to feel aligned and meaningfully engaged in that.
That sounds accurate. Yes.
Cool. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to explore a little bit of more specific domains of your life, as it were. Okay. So let's get into a couple of kind of ways of being in the world. All right. And so one of the things that I'd like to then check on is what we kind of call your habit system. And so we'll start with just some questions about how you're doing in terms of sleep. Tell me a little bit about your sleep patterns and processes.
Yeah, I sleep pretty regular schedule. Often I feel I would like a little bit more because I'm very sensitive to even small amounts of sleep missing. Okay. I don't know that it impacts my behavior, but I'm just the felt sense of not having quite enough sleep drags on me.
Do you have a sense as to how much that is? I mean, how many, try to get hours a night or hours every couple of days?
Yeah, at least 7. So probably 8 would be optimal.
Gotcha.
I'm pretty good at not being disturbed when I wake in the night. That's something I've been working on. My father had this theory that if you're up, you should just be up. But then a lot of the older people I know have sleep problems, and I suspect that they've been training the wrong way over time. And so what I try to do is stay as close to sleep as I can if I happen to be awake. I do use various tools at times, some of the sleep enhancing antihistamines or audiobooks. I do this a lot. Is an audiobook that isn't so interesting, I want to stay awake, has a good narrator, and I can put that on the headphones so that if I wake up, there's something interesting to listen to. And if I fall asleep, that's great. And it also blocks out my attentiveness to background noises and probably reminds me of my mother reading me to sleep when I was a kid. So I try to take advantage of those because I think sleep's important. And I think I probably don't do enough, right? I think, well, this is the biggest single physical activity of the day. I don't even stretch before doing it. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'm pretty well situated that way compared to the people I know, but I can see that I should probably be a little bit more deliberate than I am about it.
Gotcha. Well, certainly it is the case that both biophysiologically and psychosocially, sleep is pretty central in terms of regularity and pattern, and high sleep versus low sleep, especially over time. Big difference in terms of biophysical and psychosocial well-being. So good that you've attended so much to it. You have a history of insomnia at all? It certainly sounds like you've been pretty systematic in trying to.
Yeah, not a history of insomnia. I mean, I laying awake and thinking a lot when I was a kid. And then that's one of the reasons I really early on started to do meditative practices, was just to make that space be something more comfortable and deliberate for me rather than just seeing whatever the mind wants to show you at any given moment. But no real insomnia history. Definitely a sense of woundedness from the different sleep experiments I've done, like doing an overnight job or, getting up to travel at early times. It was increasingly aware of the hit that it takes. Right. So,
gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Did you ever have any trouble with nightmares or?
It's an interesting question because I guess the last real nightmares I remember were in my teens, but I do have, it's weird because I have dreams now that are a little bit frustrating, but they're kind of familiar. I'm like, oh, this is one, like I recognize them in the dream, and it's got the flavor of my own brain permeating, which I enjoy. So it doesn't bother me very much. But there were some interesting experiences when I was younger. there was a sequence of dreams, and I don't know when this was. I was 18 or something like that. I involved this Lord of the Underworld character. It was just a kind of like shaggy thing, right? And he would be unexpectedly in rooms, and I'd be like petrified. And this one of those series of repeating dreams with this character until I figured out in the dream how to reverse what was going on. But some of those woke into nightmares.
Okay.
Was that some of them had this? I mean, probably everybody's familiar with this. If you're trying to evade a danger in a dream, you kind of wake up a little bit, and then this is what I think. And then you're aware somewhat that you're in bed, not moving, and that your eyes are closed. So you're trying to run away from a lion. You're like, I can't really run. I can't open my eyes. What's going on? So those were troubling.
Yes,
but mostly they were interesting because what's the relationship between conscious and unconscious? So
sure. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not like a troubled history of nightmares, more like a fascinating adventure of nightmares.
All right. Fantastic. Good. Well, I can check that box then. That's a good box. That's a better box to check. All right. Let's shift a little bit then. Tell me a little bit about your eating habits. How do you feel about them? Do you feel they're regular? Do you feel they're healthy? Do you have any concerns about them? These are just some reflections.
They're regular. They could be better. I'm susceptible to processed starches. If I start on bread, then maybe a lot more bread's going in after that.
You mean susceptible to indulging upon them? Yes.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly. There's kind of a cascade effect sometimes. I'm attentive to it. I would like to be eating a lot more fermented foods and things like that I hear about. It's a little bit difficult for me to steer that because of juggling the social and the physical, right? So I normally don't eat during the day. I normally just have dinner and maybe a snack afterwards.
Okay.
And usually that feels like too much, right? I've experimented with fasting every other day, and that really works out for me. It gives me this feeling of lightness and energy and togetherness. And if I even eat a meal in a day, the next day I feel it in my body. Right? It's like some of my energy is going to this thing, and I don't want it going to that thing. I want it just available here. So then I set up these programs of fasting because I'm used to these kinds of disciplines. But very often they run into, well, you're going to eat with somebody else. You're going to eat with the kids. You're going to eat with your lover. You're going to go out with friends. So I give ground on what I know is physically better for me in order to have the relational engagement. But overall, it's not that problematic.
Gotcha.
But definitely there's more food in my body most of the time than I actually want there to be.
Okay. Do you ever have any problems with digestion or anything along those lines, or just a basic, constipation, diarrhea, anything like that?
It's hard to say what's problematic and what's sensitivity.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But I'm very aware. I pay a lot of attention to what's going on in my abdomen. I don't like there to be things in there so much. I was like this as a kid with urine. Like, it's not like I had necessarily a small bladder. I don't know what size my bladder is, but if there was a chance for me to deposit a little urine, I would do that because I wanted to.
You wanted the clean, empty, ready to roll structure. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Okay.
So if I think there's more food in my body, I think that's true. I think I defecate more than I want to. I feel like there's a little bit of a backlog in terms of sheer amount.
Okay. And is that when you eat dinner? Then is that well, we are all okay. We all are. So I'm checking that box, but it's always checked. Is that because would you say you eat very big dinners then if you don't eat during the day, or is it more just the way you're structured? Do you feel?
I think it's more the way I'm structured. I don't think, I don't eat large meals necessarily compared to other people I see eating.
Right. Okay.
I just feel like it is too much for me.
What's your kind of history of weight? Has you ever felt like you're overweight or underweight, or had problems with sort of your weight relative to where you thought you wanted to be or should be?
I was slim when I was a kid. I was a vegan for a couple of years and got kind of heavier and puffier. I think more, starches and oils.
Okay.
But it just turned out to be not quite the right diet for me. I feel the abdominal bulge, but there hasn't really been any significant fluctuation for 20 years. I'm pretty much the same mass.
Gotcha. Okay. So it feels like you're pretty comfortable with your eating. You wonder a little bit about it. It impacts you a particular way, but it's not certainly an area of concern for you.
Yeah, well, there's one, yeah, like I say, there's one particular area that I want to improve on for sure,
Okay.
or maybe a couple little other areas I want to improve on, but it's not overwhelming or traumatic. Like I'm not having allergic reactions or weird effects or anything like that, or nor any kind of weird oscillation.
Right. Okay. Next, let me just check in on your sort of pattern of activity, and these are kind of the exercise initially. And then any other kinds of practices that you engage in systematically as part of your everyday habit. So this be things like yoga, possible meditation, but let's start with just exercise. Do you have any, kind of systematic processes that you're engaged in, and, or can you tell me just what your level of physical activity is during the day?
Sure. I do a yoga workout. I'm hesitating on that because some of the parts aren't yoga. I used to teach yoga, so I improvise different things. And what I've got like a slimmed down version of what I used to do, and it's partly applicable to different aspects of physical things that have come up. Like I had a few lower back injuries, so now I can see the residual effect on my yoga practices. There's several more back related ones than there would have been in the past. So I do a workout in the morning, maybe 20 to 30 minutes, where I try to combine it with intellectual and emotional exercise at the same time because of my theory of integrative surplus. Most days I'll do yard work when I try to put everything into audiobook form so I can work in the yard, because exercise with the land, it's very soothing. It reminds me of my childhood, and I believe it's good for people in general. I like to go for walks and hikes when I can. Usually we sort of have a semi-daily sexual practice that sort of counts as physical. And yeah, that's most of it. Cool. In terms of physical exercise stuff.
Yeah. Actually, that's another domain of lifestyle habit I wanted to check in: your sexual activity, just sort of your felt sense of that relative to how satisfied you are. Obviously, frequency, satisfaction, connection. And we'll talk more about your relational world, but certainly in terms of whether this is with a partner or anything like that.
This is the relationship I'm in now is I think it's the highest frequency and satisfaction sexually of any of my previous relationships. I think partly because of the way it started and partly just of what our compatibility is, but it's evolved a little bit into a semi-ritual kind of practice. Right? So rather than being just sort of spontaneous, it's become more, was every other day, and then it's mostly every day. And then if you miss some days, it's fine.
Right. But you wove it into the lifestyle fairly deliberately.
Yeah. It was the result of discussions and experimentations and a practice that was, difficult to coordinate that. You go through a lot of weird things trying to think about it as an intentional practice, but now it's become very, very consistent and a huge, mutually emotionally needed thing, right? There's a constant dialogue now about, so glad we're doing it like this kind of feeling.
Right. Nice. Yeah.
And just as the physical part seems to be working really well, but the emotional part, just like having that kind of check-in with each other at that level with enough frequency is very satisfying. And I think something that was missing in the past. Like I think there's a lot of, angst or theorizing and experimentation that would go on in other relationships in a way, because this was kind of missing. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure society always does the best possible job in structuring that activity for us. I don't know. I'm going to go out on a limb.
There might be something there.
Might be slightly suboptimal at a societal level. I don't know. I'm going to throw it out there. I'm a crazy guy that way. Okay. And the final kind of...
I just want to say one more thing about that, because the interesting thing that affords is the sense of an abundance in which all kinds of things are easily tried, right? Like, so if you were like, this was sort of a thinking around that, like you have, if there's a kind of scarcity mentality around it, then it's really important sort of that it goes certain ways. It does certain things for you. If there's almost more than you need, then you're like, well, this time it went this way. This time it went this way. You're right. There's a real ease about all the different things it could be.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a totally different mindset when you situate it in relationship to that. And I think that many couples find themselves in the, trapped performative scarcity mindset of, self-conscious concern, as opposed to a structured system that especially if it's grounded in intimacy, that then affords the exploration, the growth, the comfort, the experimentation, etc. So it sounds like you guys were able to move in that direction.
Yeah, I'm pretty satisfied in that domain.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about substance use, alcohol, other kinds of substances, and again, sort of frequency, duration, intensity, and what your reflections are on them, about if there are any concerns or you're feeling sort of satisfied with their usage.
Yeah, no strong concerns. I probably drink a little bit more than I should, although that's changed form over the years.
Okay.
Cannabis is something that I will use a very small amount of infrequently when I have space and I want to like shuffle my idea set. I don't, any more than that generates a state that I don't love, a kind of non-relational attitude. You get kind of foggy in your own little thing. Psilocybin microdosing is something I've been experimenting with over the last couple of years. That's fun. It seems to really tip you a little bit more toward flow states and clarity and high performance. Larger amounts of psychedelics, experimented with that when I was younger, but now it's very infrequent. It might be every 5 years or something, some kind of event like that. With the drinking, beer became just it's groggy and puffy. The inflammation I can't do, and I don't want all the fluid. And I got into this thing. My father was in a coma a couple of years ago, and I started to, he used to drink scotch.
Okay.
And I got a bottle and I just sipped it every day while he was in the coma. And I'm still doing that. And so my drinking now takes the form of regular tiny sips of whiskey, often throughout the day. And it's obviously probably I'm regulating my glucose and stuff like that too. I don't like to be drunk. It feels unpleasant. I like to have a little bit. And I also have always, I like the movement. I like the fluid, I know some people smoke because they like to do this.
Yep.
I always like to just have a sipping thing in my hand.
Right.
But certainly
you get a sense of
I used to get drunk when I was younger, and now I feel like I'm managing it more carefully.
Gotcha. You have a sense of how many ounces you might consume over the course of the day?
Oh, not exactly. I would say 4 or 5 of this amounts.
Okay. Right. All right. Gotcha. Okay. And has anyone ever expressed any concern about your drinking, or have you been at a place where you were concerned about it?
Yeah, I was a little bit concerned. Well, I think there was a little bit of concern earlier, maybe 20 years ago. And I think that was mostly, I don't know. I don't know whether or not to be concerned about that. Obviously, any of these things are not the most optimal thing for your organs. But who knows what for each person is too much. Of course. Here's actually funny thing was there was a period where I was drinking very little. And I went for a physical checkup, and the doctor asked me if I was, like what amount, and I asked her what a small amount was, and what she considered to be a small amount was like 5 times what I was drinking. So then I thought, well, I should be drinking more than.
Hey, that opens me up.
But I think, the only real thing that bothered me about it, or I think bothered anybody else, was my tendency to just freewheelingly, slosh right off the road, like just go as far as I could. So the drunken frenzy kind of modes, which were fascinating to explore, but I think that was problematic, and that's basically gone now.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's hard. It depends who you talk to. I think one of the other things is I'm very open about it. I'm not waiting till 6 o'clock to have that beer. I'm just doing it whenever I think of it.
Amen. Okay. Yeah, maybe we'll come back to that, but I'm going to shift a little bit. So it gives us a sense of your sleeping, eating, exercise, or other practice activities, sex and substance use. I use that as a SEAS acronym. Let's seize what your habits and lifestyle looks like. In terms of lifestyle, can you tell me just a little bit about your living arrangements and daily patterns, and you feel safe and protected and have enough finances for that? Is there regularity to your domicile situation, domestic situation?
Yeah, well, we've got a house here. It's the first house I've had.
Yeah,
So
okay.
it's nice that it, it takes off that you feel like you have your own space, which is really nice. Feels very secure, although you're constantly, the cracks and the fissures and the insecurities and the fact that you have to look after evereveryking now. And so each thing is a potential problem. Oh, when am I going to fix that?
When am I going to get to that?
That kind of thing. But generally, it's a pleasure. It's nice to feel secure, feel safe. There's no weird trespassing, really. Sometimes the car gets broken into, but that's usually when we forgot to lock it. Yeah, that's nice. It's going along stably. The finances thing is fluid, because there's a lot of things that I could be doing to make more money that I'm not doing because I hate those things.
Trade-offs.
So it's miraculously going along, and it's been going along for a while now. So I feel confident, but then you're always worried, like, what if if it changed? I don't know.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, we'll check into occupation and finances in a little bit here. Okay, so I get this sort of grounded sense, and now I just want to move up a little bit in your systems. I want to talk a little bit about your emotions. Okay. First, let me ask you, kind of like, you have a sense about what emotions are and your frame on them in terms of, like, how do you feel about your feeling?
I had a Buddhist teacher who always defined emotion as feeling plus story.
Okay.
To separate those. So I think I do that pretty well. I have a range of emotions that feel like orchestral qualities.
Okay.
I do a lot of work around making the heart open on purpose.
Okay.
I have an interesting history with tears, where I kind of made them go away when I was younger, and then had to make them come back, and then had to get smoother about that. And I think I cry pretty regularly and gracefully now. I think of it as a source of information and as a deliberate practice. And I think that's something I could even get better at, but I've experimented a lot with the relationship between the mind and emotions.
Okay. All right.
I spent a whole year refusing to use any learned words to describe my feelings because I thought that might be a trick.
Okay. Interesting.
How do I know that anger and sorrow and happiness are the emotions and not just what they trained me in kindergarten to assume were the emotions?
Well, that's a very good, you should read up on Lisa Feldman Barrett versus Jaak Panksepp. This is a wonderful debate if you want an analytic dispute. And in my field of psychology as to whether or not how to figure about that. Okay. So, but what I'm hearing here is sort of access to a lot of different kind of frames, an experiential sense of attending to your emotions in a pretty rich way. You can watch them sort of fluctuate. You have a notion about, you kind of want to integrate them with your narrative, your felt sense of being, some fluidity, flexibility in that.
Yeah, it's pretty flexible. It's pretty coherent. It's pretty accessible, and definitely a lot better at speaking them than I used to be.
All right. Well, welcome to manhood. All right. At multiple levels. Let me talk a little bit then about kind of a felt sense of your sense of positive emotion. Okay. The frequency with which you would feel like desire and contentment and, general joy. And then maybe contrast that to the frequency you feel sort of depressed, anxious, distressed, the negative cluster.
This question's make me feel pretty good. I'm doing a comparison between how I would answer now and how I would have answered even 10 years ago. I used to have angry outbursts sometimes in intimate relationship discussions at certain points, similar to the patterns that I saw in the house when I was a kid, that kind of thing. But boy, that hasn't happened in a while. My overall sense of positive emotion, there's always been a positive tone in the background, I think, most of my life, but I'm definitely better at a range of them. I have a lot of joy, I have a lot of curiosity, I have a lot of desire, I have a lot of interest. I get a lot of situations of what seems to be spontaneous appreciation, but obviously it's partly been trained. And I do a lot of gratitude-like practices as well.
Okay.
But they're not quite as interesting as spontaneously arising. A sense of novel positive emotion is what I really like. When I have a feeling, I'm like, oh, I don't even know what this feeling is. I like it though. The negative ones, far less present than they used to be. Little bits of worry, but they're mostly it's like I mostly sidestep them now, or know what they are, or something like they're just sort of fringe characters.
All right.
I want to pause here for a second because I don't want to rush past anything that I might be overlooking.
There was a time when you had problems with tears or sadness or felt sense of vulnerability. These are sometimes...
when I was a kid, I remember an incident where I tried not to cry, and I don't know what the real dynamics are, but I basically didn't cry for the next 15 to 20 years after that, until I decided this would be a really good thing to do. Then I had to kind of relearn the skill. And then I think it was, I would go too into it, right? I was just like totally weeping and that, right? And then that would burn me out a little bit. So I've tried to get smoother about that, I think. I definitely, somebody asked me to go through their, I can't remember who it was. He was doing a sensitive persons leading to integral thinking study to see if there was a connection. And one of the questions is, are you easily disturbed and upset by things you view? And when I was answering it, I had just wept watching this, TV show. Yeah. But it wasn't disturbing. I wasn't upset. I'm just like, that was just an extremely intense, poignant human suffering experience. That made me feel like this for a minute. So that kind of thing. So I think I'm very sensitive, but I'm not that disturbed by the sensitivity.
Right. Okay. All right. So there's a felt sense of attunement. You can access that, but in terms of like, oh God, that is in of itself a threat, where you feel regularly vulnerable or anxious about encountering negative feelings, or sort of on edge or defended against them. You have some history maybe of like anger getting overexposed or other kinds of things, at least, but it feels the resonant for you on those domains feels pretty good these days.
Yeah, it does feel pretty good these days. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to then move in. Let's talk a little bit about your relationships.
Okay.
So let's get a little bit of map about your relationships, and let's back up a little bit and just put me in your extended family. Tell me a little bit about where you were born and a little bit about where you were raised, and what was the system that brought you into the world?
Okay. I was born on a rural island in the Pacific Northwest, at home, because Dad figured he'd delivered a few calves, so he might be able to handle a human.
Well, okay.
Some of their choices would terrify me.
Talk about a little anxiety in the home situation, right? Hey, I got to handle this.
Dad was it just seemed like he could do anything and talk to anybody. And he did, built things, made inventions, spent a lot of his time in very direct jobs, though, logging and fishing and tree planting and that kind of stuff, until we were older and moved to the city. It was very, old timey. It was a big piece of land, and Mom and Dad were pretty much at home most of the time, except in the summer when he would go fishing. I had a younger brother by 3 years. Which, I respect him, but it was fractious, that relationship, and still is. And an older brother from my dad's previous marriage. We seldom saw him, but he and I always got along intellectually. There were a lot of things for us to discuss together. I liked him a lot.
Okay.
Is there any other particular directions? Like,
tell me a little bit about your
school life.
Yeah, well, let's start with your mom. Tell me a little bit about your relationship, and maybe a little bit more detail in the relationships you had with both your mom and your dad, and how their relationship was.
My mother was, she got out of school and was sort of, she would have been the witch or shaman in the village if we still lived in a village. traveled the world, worked as a nurse, had a kind of storybook marriage that she hated and fled from, and met my dad, and was very very open about all these other dimensions of life, like I talking about her relationship with spirit and asking it to step aside so she could have kids, and all the deja vu experiences she had when she first saw the house, and very very well read, very literate person who liked to use all the words she knew. Prone to certain kinds of reaction and negativity. Maybe seemed like she spoke a lot and thought she wasn't being seen or heard.
Gotcha.
But very very tuned in, dynamic, kind of post hippie, worldly experienced person. Very attentive, very good at providing the meals and looking after wounds and kind of running the farmstead kind of thing.
Would you say you were close to both your mom and your dad?
Yeah, very much so. Still am, but in different ways. I was just visiting my mother. Wonderful. It's just wonderful to be there, but it's also an angst. You see this person who shifts between these just incredible, lovely, brilliant modes, and then these reactive, unnecessarily critical, classic.
Did they divorce? Did your mom and dad
They
divorce?
did, yeah. So after the kids were all grown, I think they were both looking already for a different kind of adventure, but she met a guy they were going to Tai Chi retreats together. And then there was a moment where she started to go to Tai Chi retreats by herself. And you're like, okay, something's going on here. That's that's how that thing happens. So she met this other guy fantastic guy. I really like him. But they ended up moving to the Caribbean together and being very sophisticated world travelers. He has a neat background. We all get along really well. Actually, it's very delightful. I mean, I often Zoom calls with them. They're very fun and very active, smart, capable, even healthy people for their mid 70s. My dad is it was interesting when they separated. He brought us all together and told us all, and then kind of cried, and my brother stormed off and then came back in. He storms off a lot. That's his thing. And then my dad had this, I loved it. He had all this free time suddenly, right? So he and I would meet weekly. And this went on for years. And I just got to know him as a person in a way that I never could have if she'd always been there. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that was great to me. So there's a real sweetness there, but there's also a comfortable distance. I think for both of them, they came away from their families, him in particular, and he was very much stressed a kind of loving support and independence kind of thing, where you don't even need to check in, right? You're like, well, I've got a kid, but I haven't heard from him in 6 months kind of thing. And the sense is that's okay, that you should each be working on your own thing and then only sometimes checking in. So I mean, he's incredibly sweet. I just have this great feeling about him. And I always wonder, should I be reaching out more? And I want to tell him more things, but I also know that's not exactly what he wants, right? He's more comfortable just being.
Gotcha. And when was this that they, how old were you about?
I was, I want to say 30, something like that, or maybe a little earlier, 28.
And right now, how old are you?
46.
46, right. Okay, I think you mentioned that. Gotcha. And then, shift a little bit into childhood. Then, okay, so you have an older half brother, you have a younger brother, parents are together on this island. Then you kind of evolve into, grow into childhood. How was the early childhood like in terms of if you shift into views of your friends? How did you get along with people? How did people see you?
I was, I have a kind of golden haze memory. It was really, I mean, it was safe and adventurous. And there was a lot of free space to think whatever you wanted to think. My brother and I played a lot of physical games together, but I don't know if it's just the way we are or his temperament or whatever. It was every game ended in a yelling match,
Mhm.
like literally every game.
A lot of hyper competitiveness between the two of you, perhaps?
Yeah, or something getting thrown,
something.
or
Okay.
accusations, or right,
Okay.
it was an overload of some kind. A lot of ways we didn't really get along. Like, we're not necessarily compatible in many respects.
Right.
With friends, usually a core cabal of people who could go on
Mhm.
adventures with me, and I was very often kind of symbolically leaderly.
Mhm.
Like, let's play war, and I'm going to be the this,
Mhm.
or
Okay.
I only wanted to do things that I came up with.
Mm.
I didn't want to, like, you guys want to play football? No, I want to play a sport that I just invented this weekend in the woods. Are you guys coming?
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Good to go. Good to know.
But it was small. I mean, it was a little community, right?
Right.
The school was kindergarten to grade 7, and there was 100 kids. So
Okay.
you basically knew everybody, even though we lived outside of town, right? So it was miles of dirt road to anybody would think it's the smallest town in the world, but it was the big city for the people in the outlying region.
Right.
So most of our friends were outliers. There were several outlying regions,
Okay.
and a lot of, hippie family things. You see, like, man, like pictures of people smoking dope and being naked and living in shacks and all bearded and stuff when you're like a baby. So that was fun. It was very open, very, very supportive. A lot of that kind of back to the land community support feeling.
Gotcha. Were you seeing a particular? Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I did really well at all the school things, like physically and mentally. But
were you seen a particular way? I mean, like, as really competent and popular, or a jokester, or some kind of weird or eccentric, or
maybe a bit of all those things. I mean, we had an exchange teacher in grade 7 who was going to make a video of the class and send it back to where he was from in Dubbo, Australia. He referred to me as the class clown, which caught me off guard because that wasn't a normal way that I was referred to.
Right.
And it may be because he was coming in temporarily or with fresh eyes or something like that. Because I did favor things that were strange, and I was able to be performative in the class setting.
Right.
But I think it probably was viewed as, more like academically inclined, just the kid who does well on the tests or sometimes does well at the sports. There was an issue around a track meet, I remember, where I'd gone to the track meet with the different schools a couple of years and got a bunch of ribbons and was like, it doesn't do me any good to get a ribbon. What the hell am I doing this for? So then there was tryouts, and I'm like, well, okay, get out of class and run around. Fantastic. So I came first in several of the activities and then didn't sign up for the track meet. And my mother got called because, and it was like sort of this thing where, to me, it seemed like they were lying. Like they were saying it was about me, and really they wanted the school to get ribbons.
Right.
So I remember a teacher yelling at her on the phone, and she finally paid me $20 to sign up for the thing. And
oh, wow. Yeah.
And then I deliberately threw a race because I was like, fuck you guys.
Give him the middle finger because, kind of an anti-authoritarian fuck you. Huh? Yeah.
I had some moments like that where my sense of security and critique and maybe a bit of the anger thing too would lead to I'm taking a stand on this.
Yeah. Gotcha. And then in terms of your coming into adolescence and emerging identity, sexuality, romantic partners, what about that stage?
Yeah. So for me, there's a big shift after grade 7 because we move.
Okay.
We go to the big city, and now I'm in a huge school, and there's all that kind of stuff. So that there's a break there in terms of how I would answer those questions differently on either side of that break. Gone along well with boys and girls. Didn't really get into relationships in elementary school. There was one that sort of came up, and I was like, I thought about it seriously for a while, and then decided I wasn't that interested. Was really getting into science fiction and science and logic, but at the same time, elves and witchcraft and the occult and all this other kind of stuff that I thought, alchemy and the history of magic and the Renaissance and things like that fascinated me. So increasingly, as I went into high school. So now there's a lot of different interactions with girls I don't know. There's a lot more access to information. There's a really quick funneling of my interests toward philosophy and religion. starts to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And an upsurge of a need to do surrealistic adventures. Like I started to be the thing where I would like lead small groups of people on physical adventures when I was younger became, let's have like random adventures. Let's have non-linear experiences.
Totally.
Yeah. And so that through high school, but it looked like I was on a very direct academic arc. But by the last 2 years, I didn't care very much about that. I started to take advantage of the school as a theater of experimentation, as long as I kept the grades up. Right.
And in terms of romantic partners and sexual identity orientation, and how did that, kind of emerge?
Yeah. Well, little bits of experimental social emotional play. Nothing really sexual until the last 2 years of high school.
Okay.
Pornography. Back when it was in magazines.
Yeah, I remember. That happened, folks.
Yeah, and very
doesn't always just a click away.
Because I've told this story a couple times in different discussions, but there was a thing about the pornographic magazine, which was, I found, a way you like move through it. First, you go, yeah, this is great. And then you're like, oh, this section's my favorite. And then I'm bored of my favorite. You go to these other sections, then you get bored of them, and you're kind of using up the magazine, which is why it was monthly or something back then. And then you go to the back, and there's all this weird stuff. And it bothered me that other people were having pleasures I wasn't having. Right. So I'd be like, I'm only attracted to these fairly typical, right? They're basically the same race as me. They're kind of classic. But these other people, if somebody's looking at overweight transsexuals, like, I should be able to get off on all these things. Right. And so, or like, men or all this stuff. Right. So I would experimentally try to masturbate to some of the other kinds of images. And it was hard. I couldn't get there. Right. It was like, okay, this
or not.
Yeah, okay, exactly. Like, I think I might be straight. So I was right. And not just as a guess, I proved it by experiment. So now I can kind of rest in that.
Right.
So that was pretty straightforward. And, then I,
pun intended,
I married my high school sweetheart.
Okay.
For a couple of years.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So let me talk to you about sort of like, your felt sense of being in relation.
Yeah.
Okay. In general, looking over the history, would you say that you felt seen, known, and valued by the important people in your life overall? Or is there substantive times where you feel not seen, known, and valued? And if so, then talk to me a little bit about.
I would say generally, yes. I think probably, some of the times that were the most upsetting were times where I thought it seemed like somebody who I trusted suddenly didn't. That provoked a lot of anxiety or attempt to exert control.
Like there was a sense of betrayal at some level, or
like
potentially on one side or the other.
I thought you knew who I was. How can you say that about me? How can you? Okay. Yeah. Have you been thinking a different thing about me the whole time when I've been assuming? Right. And those were usually, I found I was pretty good at steering a relationship back on track. And that's actually my story of how the first marriage went, which was you'd get into these recurring cycles of things going off track around certain themes. And I'd seen my parents do this. I remember as a kid talking to my mom about, oh, you guys have an argument so I could see a cycle happening. So then I was in a cycle and I could correct for the cycle. And then I would start to try different ways of correcting for the cycle. And then I got to the point where like, I don't want to correct for the cycle anymore. Next time I'm just going to let it go and not try to fix this.
Okay. Right.
I think being in an intimate relationship is a really important factor for me. It took me a while to realize how much of my life is centered around that. And so when I didn't quite realize that, then things that disrupted that would produce little explosions.
Okay. When you're in relation, let's say it starts to feel threatened, what happens to your system? Do you feel like, in what you described, do you feel like you can kind of reestablish the cycle? If you have that capacity, you can kind of do that. Or are there times when you feel like, oh no, and then I need to really attach to the person or really just show some signals that I'm really hurt? Or do you also get a feeling or a different feeling of, oh, fuck this, I'm moving away, I don't need other people, I should just be on my own? Do you get any of those things sound resonant to you when you think about
the one that sounds the most resonant is demonstrating signals, right? And I had a strong ability through practices as well as temperament, I guess, to watch myself. So I'd be taking notes even while I was being upset. And usually I would then think that if I'm justified in the upset, then I go, well, am I justified? I mean, it actually feels kind of good to be upset. I feel powerful. I feel like it's fair what I'm doing in response to the unfairness that just came at me. Then you go, well, actually, there may be better ways. This might not be good for me. Maybe I didn't need to punch the wall or whatever it is. Then you go, well, but that's also communication, right? So for a lot of it, I thought that demonstrating pain was an important part of managing the relationship as a communication signaling process. Not convinced of that anymore, but it's not out of the question. So I think that's the one I resonate with the most. There is trying to demonstrate. Here's look, this is how that makes me feel, like this.
Right. Gotcha. Understand. Do you feel sort of in relation, we can kind of create some broad classes of sort of some tendencies. So I'll throw some out there and see how they resonate. Do you see yourself as sort of tender-minded and polite and go along, get along, or sort of tough-minded, critical, edgy, or somewhere in the middle?
Somewhere in the middle. It sounds best, right? I can be quite patient and quite diplomatic, but I also take stands against things in ways that might sometimes sound very even-tempered,
irritable or disagreeable. Right.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think you're an idiot. That kind of thing.
Gotcha.
And inwardly very critical. The criticism is not necessarily. I don't necessarily have a problem with things I criticize, but I'm extremely critical. So I judge things that are happening and often judge them to be inadequate. But I don't think everyone always has to hear about that, or that means I have to act in the mode of problem response.
Gotcha. The focus of that judgment, the world, the future, self, others, distributed, depending. Everywhere
I look, and developmental behavioral systems. Like when I see a person, I'm not judging them. I'm judging them like this pattern of behavior appears to me to lead to these sorts of outcomes, which are substandard. And that's the same thing when I see the news, right? I'm not sure I don't care what the world's doing, but I'm like, oh, look, that's how global capital behaves. That's substandard, that kind of thing. So like a splattergun approach, analyzing behaviors critically.
Right. When you bring a particular frame of reference, you have some sort of extension capacity for optimal, you immediately see discrepancies of the optimal, and then you'll bring to bear those kinds of analyses, but you're not necessarily sharing them on your, on your sleeve and edge.
There's a contrarian streak there. There's a pleasure in reversals. Like if I hear 4 or 5 times what's happening in a certain part of the world, I go, yeah, I don't know. I'm hearing too much about that. Maybe it's the opposite of that.
Okay. Right. Gotcha. Okay. Sort of in relationship then to kind of your felt sense of being self-oriented, like, hey, I really focus on me, I take care of me, I can get anger, defend. Other-oriented, I look to other people, I worry about them, I feel the need to be connected to them, I feel guilt and love. That balance between the two, would you say you kind of orient self, orient other, pretty healthy balance? Hard to say.
I probably lean a little bit more towards self, and I structure things so that it looks balanced, which is to say, like if I pick a big chunk of my time and use it for myself, then in the rest of the time, which might be a smaller chunk of time, I can be very other oriented.
Okay.
I like to cook for people. I like to have conversations with the kids. I like to have the conversations I think no one else is having with them. Like I'm very attentive to what might be missing.
Okay.
But I'm, like I said, that when I was talking about my dad, that sense of I'm going to trust that people are okay unless I hear differently, and I don't have to constantly communicate, even with the people I am very close to emotionally. But if I'm not getting a lot of private time in certain ways, then I'm not capable of being that guy as much.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm going to shift a little bit again, talk a little bit about how you feel like you adjust to the environment. So the word here is like coping in terms of, first let me ask, do you feel generally pretty secure in your basic relationship to the environment? And then when you get bumped by the world, do you feel like you're somebody that can be kind of resilient in the way you adjust to it, that you're in a pretty good state, or, hey, you're kind of vulnerable and fragile, can get knocked off where you're situated?
I think I've adapted fairly well, and I'm aware of the values of adaptation very clearly. So I talk about it and think about it a lot, but I never know how good I am, right?
Okay.
You're always worried that the adaptation might catch you off guard, or you might not be capable of it. I think I have been, and I think it's something I've tried to work on. I think I've sort of set myself as part of my practice over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, leaning into spaces that feel risky or that feel unknown, and kind of privileging those in the hopes of decompressing anxiety and gaining adaptivity. So I feel much more comfortable with that than I did, and maybe that some of that's just aging. I'm not sure.
Okay. You use humor to cope, would you say, or at least to manage stress?
I use humor a lot, but I'm not sure if I use it to cope.
Okay.
It's like I have a bit of the comedian sensibility. It's like it's too special for that. I'm not going to waste comedy on coping.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you feel like when you hit adversity, you're able to bounce back okay and pretty quickly achieve equilibrium overall?
Yeah, I do. And, part of me is afraid that I just haven't hit sufficient adversity yet to learn the opposite about myself. The people I care about are still alive.
Okay.
But I've definitely seen myself process through things fairly quickly and fairly stably.
Gotcha.
I have a number of schemes for doing that. And also a kind of, like there's a clenched functional mode where I can just function for a while without thinking about it. So I realized over time, at first I thought that was maybe problematic, but now I see it's really useful to be able to delay the experience sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I haven't hit anything that I haven't been able to process through, I think.
Okay. I'll shift a little bit again and want to talk a little bit about your identity. This is how you think about yourself. And sort of, we talked a little bit about overall how your life is going, and that's kind of a relationship that we have to the world and how that's unfolded. Now we can think about ourselves, and kind of how would we evaluate ourselves, kind of think about our, hey, we're really happy with ourselves, not so happy, think about the choices that you've made and your abilities, and do you feel, content with who you are? You feel compassion and acceptance for who you are, or the reverse, kind of a critical, internalized sense of, gosh, I wish I were different or better, or frustrated with self?
Pretty content with who I am, I would think. It's been the sense of a higher or deeper identity has been with me the whole time. I have little child scrawl writing talking about it on pieces of paper from when I could barely write. A lot of my early 20s was spent around trying to get more visceral access to my sense that there was another kind of intelligence. However I conceived that at different times, a higher self or me outside of time or whatever that was, there was this other me. I think I'm much more like that other me now. Whether I was just doing those things to steer in this direction or not, or whether they're part of the metaphysics of reality, that's an open question.
Okay.
But I also have, let's say I'm better at and more interested in making decisions, right? And I like the decisions I make. I like to weigh them out to a place. There's a certain kind of quality. I go, yeah, that's the kind of decision that I would make. And so however it turns out, I'll be happy with that decision.
Okay.
So I think I'm much better at that now as a result of deliberate practice. And there's another element of looking for identity and not finding it. Right. I had a long period of sort of being transparent to myself. And now there's a sort of smooth fullness in the space that used to look empty, but it still has that same quality where I'm like, when you ask about identity, so I'm like, well, identity? Where is an identity? I don't that kind of feeling. This is really good. I don't know if it counts as an identity or not. That kind of thing.
Gotcha. Okay. How do you feel in relationship to kind of your felt sense of being in the inside relative to what some people call a persona or what you put out in the other? Do you feel like you're able to have a sort of integrity or a sense of coherence with who you try to present to others? Do you often feel like you have to put on a mask, or there's a discrepancy between how you have to present? Are there particular contexts where there's a big discrepancy between how you feel on the inside, the outside?
Well, there are contexts where it's easier and contexts where it's harder. I mean, I think, going to your friend's family's holiday, when you're like, everybody's just going to say the boringest thing in the world. And you're like, I don't have to be here. Like, this is nonsense. Like that, I feel a big discrepancy in some of those areas where there's just there's no real exchange between people at any intelligent or deep level. And I feel like I'm just a persona, and it's not the persona I like to be.
Right.
Whereas, Layman Pascal is me, but also a character. Right. So in these spaces, when I'm writing or a lot of, it's sort of developed over time, my ability to inhabit more places through this characterization of myself, which is a characterization that brings a lot of my passions and affords me a lot of interesting interactions. So I'm quite happy with this kind of persona space.
Gotcha.
And they blur a little bit, right? There's medium range, or I tone it down a little bit, but just keep it simmering.
How would you say you kind of relate to the issue of kind of self-control and sort of trying to order your environment? Would you say you really have a high need for order or low need for order, and are able to and want to kind of discipline yourself towards achievement, industriousness, and control? How does that kind of dynamic play itself out for you?
Yeah, I can make several different plausible arguments on this one.
Okay.
My mother called me a control freak sometimes when I was a kid. But I don't think it wasn't like, like having everything just right. It would be like certain things I would get very passionate about and be willing to take an enormous stand on them being one way rather than the other.
Okay.
That's something I actively struggled against in myself to become smoother and more flexible. So I'm pretty smooth and pretty flexible. I think when a lot of people get snagged on having things a certain way, I can have a strong reaction about how I want them to be, but I don't get trapped in it the same way. However, I do a lot of intentional, disciplined things. Making myself do things is I think an informed and pleasurable practice, become more pleasurable. But just the very act of intentional control is intriguing. It's fascinating. It builds a thing. And so I do a lot of that. Right? I like to schedule now. I didn't used to like to schedule. I like to make, and even some of it's a lot of fun. Whim fulfillment is my simplified version of intention building practice, where you get an idea that you absolutely don't have to do. And I go, you know what? I'm going to make myself do that. That's now a commitment. It doesn't have to occur, but I'm going to make that occur.
Right.
And some of them some of it's even arbitrary. You're like, like I'm going to, like if I'm out on a walk and you see like some scungy bit of orange peel, you pick it up and you're like, I'm going to put this in the garbage. And you think, oh, no, I'm actually going to keep holding it just like this for 1 hour and then put it in the garbage. Right. And you're like, just the arbitrary exercise of control. So for me, it feels very creative, feels very free. Compared to people around me, I don't take a lot of issue with things or try to exert too much control, but I'm actually doing something that if I described it to people, they'd say, you might be really trying to control things a lot there, buddy.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So I'll shift yet again a little bit, do a little bit of retrospective kind of structure. Are there particular events in your life that are formative? And these can be both really negative events, possible trauma events, or also real achievement events that you think, kind of really would be necessary to know or had a lasting impact on your structure or how you developed?
That's a really difficult question. I mean,
Okay.
I can point to some moments that would stand out to me if I was writing a biography that I cared about.
Right.
But the interface between structure and unfolding and events is
at the highest level. I'm sort of especially looking for any particular defining trauma moments that you would identify.
Yeah, I don't know. So I had some physical things when I was a kid. I fell down a flight of stairs and knocked myself out. Broke my nose. I have like a vague memory of coming out of it. And my parents had the flu, and my mother coming down the stairs like upset and all discolored from the flu. And I'm just coming out of unconsciousness with pain and the horrible moments like that.
Right.
I fell and broke my leg off a roof when I was a kid. So some things like that where, a Scientologist would argue that you got your engram imprinted on you when you were unconscious and in pain or something like that.
All right. Gotcha.
Those sorts of things, one or two embarrassments interesting to me, right? There were a couple of moments when I was a kid, and partly because I was normally on top of everything, where I got hit with something that in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that was embarrassing. But I didn't experience it as embarrassing. I just shut down and powered through and moved on and made sure that never happened again. Right. So later I've tried to explore things that I didn't feel like I experienced a lot when I was a kid. Guilt, shame, embarrassment. I've got very curious about these things and tried to lean into them. Yeah, I think mostly that kind of stuff. Not much else that would even be close to the trauma area, except maybe some of the, it's hard to know. Like you interact with somebody and they're very emotionally charged interactions. And after a while, you see yourself change your behavior.
Right.
And you don't know whether, did I just gradually conclude that? Or was there really something I didn't notice that was a real overload for me there? And I'm just not going back to that zone.
Okay.
And then lots of positive things. Mostly it would be, some peak experiences. That's almost how I think of my autobiography is a series of those, right? When you see the face of God or Saul the Koan, right? The first time, and you're just like, oh my God, this is possible. If this is possible, then probably everybody should be doing this. Right. Or I'm
this is a pathway to something, right? Yeah.
If you got to gamble on something in life, I'm going to gamble that way. Everything else is at risk because this needs to be
right. This is key.
Yeah.
This is central. Okay. And we mentioned this, you said that things were relatively stable financially. Can you tell me a little bit about your occupational history and where you are in terms of just jobs you've either had or the job you're currently in, if you're in a job? Or
yeah, well, I didn't do a lot of that when I was younger. And then when it got into the spiritual thing, that same thing, you kind of drift away from those parts of life and live right off the grid for a while. And I remember I wanted to go for a physical checkup, and then you needed to have filed your taxes. And I remember that moment because I'm like, all right, I got to do my taxes. And I got to do them for several years. And then I started doing paperwork, and it was like, that's when I started coming back into the system. And I mean, I had lots of like odd jobs, little things. Probably the first one was a janitor at a advanced hair salon kind of thing. Mostly I've tried to, I experiment with it because I think, I don't like doing those things. And so I take them on as challenges to see where my boundary is. But usually I conclude after a little while that I actually don't like doing this, and kind of deviate away from it. I picked up I was teaching, yoga and meditation and giving some public talks, taking money in that way for a while. And it started to get a little bit boring. And I moved into this thing. I used to go on Craigslist and look for the weirdest jobs and just like not even do a res, just write to the guy and be like, hey, I'll do it, whatever it is. Right. So then I got into weird situations. So one guy was doing some kind of weird Lovecraft themed paintball in the woods that was also an escape room outside. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm in. And then I ended
Sign me up.
Yeah. So then I had a good relationship with that guy. I ended up working out and then managing this escape game place, which was like the most stable, functional job I had to that point. But then I had to move for this relationship. We came out here. We ran a shop together. COVID kind of took it down. So now we got collaborate on like a subversion of the shop that's at a market. And then I do some teaching work and things like that, as well as odd little different kinds of jobs that I still experiment with, and online tasks, editing books and things like that. But so far I've been able to stay just above the self-destruction line and just below the line of doing things. There's a sweet spot there where it's anxious sometimes. But it keeps me close to the things that I want to do, and it hasn't crashed yet. So I'm willing to take that risk so far.
Is there anything more about your relationship with your partner that would be helpful for just know in terms of the nature of its connection? We talked some about the sexual relation. It feels like a pretty strong, intimate, meaningful partnership.
Yeah, and there's I tell that story at different scales, right? I've been here, but also, we met in 2001 or something like that. Had a really intense night and couple of conversations together, and then out of our lives, years and years go by, and you can't even I remember thinking of her sometimes and trying to remember if I was getting the name right. Would I make this person up?
Right.
And I felt really vulnerable to her in a certain way. I thought this is a person I would do things for. So in the history of relationships, there's this bigger story of this other relationship that comes up and then comes back and then gets worked out, and very passionate, but also a lot of quite conscious exploration of our patterns and reactions and things. So it was always good, but it's so smooth compared to the way it was good, even just a few years ago.
Nice. Okay.
And that's my fundamental node of connection to the world is this person.
Okay. When you look out at your life, do you feel like there are any particular really domains of challenge that really haven't come up in our discussion, and issues of, say, memory or attention or weird thoughts or sort of obsessions or any kinds of like symptoms that concern you or challenges that we haven't touched on or that impact your life?
Inwardly, not so much. Not things like attention and memory or emotion or things like that. I always wonder if I'm doing enough. I feel, sort of impotent to implement the changes that I think are necessary for the world. I think is starting to emerge. I'm not sure how many of my adaptations are stable enough to handle what I think are pretty inevitable system disruptions that are coming. Right. And I don't know what that looks like. It seems every solution seems inadequate. I can grow a few things in the yard to eat and have some friends in the neighborhood, but what do we all do if the natural gas isn't providing heat and it's winter here 6-7 months a year? So there's these kind of community systems areas where I know I want to say to everybody, this is important, but I don't know how to solve it. So there's anxiety there and around what the world the kids are going to live in looks like, and whether it's going to be able to keep affording me all the things I love. My life being me is fantastic. Right. So there's like a moral commitment to keep that going. Don't know what that looks like at the next bigger scale. How do you manage things at that realm?
Sure, of course.
I know everybody's sort of standing in front of that question, but it upsets me.
Gotcha. In terms of within your particular local system, your sense of trajectory in the unfolding, month, year, 5-year future? Do you have a sense that you're on a good trajectory and that growth and the love your life kind of thing, as long as the macro system holds? Is there a felt sense that that's going to continue to grow? Is there a felt sense of anxiety or vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I would say felt sense wise, I feel pretty good about that.
Okay.
Analytically, I could go either way on it.
Mm-hmm.
But if systems hold together, I can see I'd like to, move out of here in a couple of years once the kids stop needing the local schooling. I like adapting to new places. It's been fun to be here. It's a very different climate than what I grew up in, and I like adapting to new climates.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm doing in my life is continues to grow. So I don't necessarily I don't have like a 6-month or 5-year plan. I have the next couple of projects that seem to have the same quality that I've been leaning into, that's been growing for me.
Okay.
So I feel confident with that momentum, and part of that is comfortable not knowing where it's going. Like I'm committed to doing it a certain way that I think leads to growth, rather than trying to decide where it's going, although I have some guesses about where I'd like to end up.
Gotcha. And in terms of your current family system, you said kids, and who are they in terms of other you?
Right. So
you came into a relationship with children.
Yeah. So she's got kids from her previous relationship. There's twins and then an older girl. They're great. I really like them. With that, it's nice to the limited, right? Because then they can go back between these two households, which are both very stable and full of smart, supportive people. That means we are every other week, right? So that's a lot of you get to still have a life outside of that, which I think is important. It might be, I never really wanted kids. Right? It was interesting. A thing I just always noticed about myself. It didn't seem that interesting. I also was so impressed by certain things about my parents that I thought, well, I'm not going to top that. But I did start to look after kids at a certain point where, when my friends started to have kids, and I got, then you got god kids and this kind of thing, you're looking after them. And then you get really interested in the educational thing. So I'm sitting on a lot of those conclusions and processes now. So I like to see it play out. And when you also happen to like them, then it's easier. And they're interesting, smart, funny creatures.
Great. We've covered a lot of ground. Are there any domains in your world or life, or either good or bad, or just important, that we haven't covered that you think would be meaningful to touch on?
I love God. That always strikes me as a hilariously weird thing to say. It used to be pretty standard, I guess. But
totally.
I have this there's some kind of weird, I don't even know how to say it. When I say I love God, I feel like I don't mean anything I've ever heard anybody point to when they say the word God. I know some of them, there's some of these words that I will always put in quotes, but the emotion isn't in quotes. And I felt my whole life very much steered by a combination of deeper, subtle, idiographic factors, but then also by some kind of transcendental like phenomenon or relationship that haunted me from the beginning and tasked me with studying it and relating to it and practicing with it. I think about it differently than I used to think about it, but it's still the overwhelming concern, and it surprises me. Like if at the beginning of this talk you're like, hey, your overwhelming concerns, it probably wouldn't have come up, right? It's not there where I'm trying to like tell people about the Lord or something like that. But when I start shifting things around and looking inside, I'm like, oh, there it is.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, great. All right. Well, that sort of summarizes kind of the domains that I would assess, and we can then dialogue a little bit about, kind of what we found, as it were, if you want. But this would bring the sort of the psychological diagnostic well-being interview to a close.
You're a type 7. Okay.
Right. So anyway, for people listening, that's the sort of structured, semi-structured interview format that we developed. And obviously we went, pretty rich and detailed, and we wouldn't want systems necessarily to be doing that, but I wanted to afford the opportunity of kind of what is the backdrop schema places that I am looking, and how are they organized, and how might they bring to bear a particular picture of an individual that would afford us kind of a way to situate him or her in relation and make some evaluations of their functioning and well-being and things like that.
It's a streamlined analytic approach to make sure that it includes all these different areas that fit into the model. And in this case, for just the general checkup rather than somebody coming in with a particular issue they want to deal with.
Exactly.
Well,
so
what's your overall take?
This is going to be no surprise. You're on virtually every broad indicator. There's just high levels of functioning. This is so the if we look at, so basically then we want to look at, all right, what is the overall alignment? And then is it contextualized in a functional system with functional metacognitive reflexivity? So a high overall alignment with reflective identity that would afford the capacity in a nested system to be, that's what the sort of nested model of well-being would look at. The happiness with the worthiness to be happy is the summary of it. And it's the alignment of at least what I would consider to be sort of the broad universalist value structure and an understanding of character functioning in a nested developmental socio-historical context that affords clarity or analyzes the coherent integrated structure, the optimal nature of the functioning, the potentiality of it, its history. So when you look at you from that perspective, it's not only a clean bill of health, but it presses into optimality.
Happy and worthy to be happy. That sounds pretty good.
That's a Kantian, that's a Kant's conception sort of the ultimate sort of well-being. And what it ties to is happiness, then that's felt sense of the psyche. Yeah. And then from sort of the outside from a causal, explanatory, descriptive, and then normative, value, axiological perspective, the worthiness in that regard.
That's a fascinating aspect of all this. I feel like the self-esteem movement was trying to get at that, and it was sort of botched in its social implementation and perhaps in its original theoretic formulation.
Well, they suckered themselves. Of course, it was methodological behaviorism, empirical psychology shit. Okay, so that's the problem. They find that self-esteem makes all this difference. Okay, because it networks into so many different things, but they don't know its ontology. They don't have a good theoretical framework for what gives rise to it. And then it just dissipates as a set of findings. And then we become self-esteem nation, where the idea is we're going to actually try to just cultivate it. Okay. And then protect it. And then actually, if you understand that, it's well-intentioned, but you get like Jonathan Haidt's coddling the American mind. It's sort of like, we're going to try to protect everybody from any kind of injury. And guess what you do? You build a raw, nerve, sensitive, neurotic system when you actually should be out there and getting emotional calluses and toughen yourself up a little bit. There's a particular way of what it is. So that's just a side commentary.
I definitely, when I look at my schooling, one of the things that's really disappointing is just how rewarded I was for things that were basically my temperament or my inbuilt capacities, right? I was clearly, it made me feel bad, right? There were kids who just didn't have the same character traits as me, and they were being not only punished, but kind of mocked. Totally. And I was getting a pat on the head just for having the memory that I had, rather than being asked to really do things that I didn't know how to do or felt uncomfortable with or needed to struggle to grow and help other people with, or things like that. It's real sad to me that was. Yeah.
I think I think there are ways to understand how to position in the proximal zone of proximal development, the proper relationship between temperament, particular kinds of capacities, learning structures, and afford optimal growth for individuals to reach their potential relative to the environmental and genetic constraints in that dynamic. We don't know. I think there's a way to do that. There's certainly not a distributed knowledge on how to do that. We fuck that up all the time. But there are ways of doing it if you understand what you're actually trying to look at and actually how to position the dynamic adaptive structures, in relation. and assess what's potential and what's not in the zone of proximal development. So one question I have, so how was it in terms of what you were expecting and anything you noticed in relationship to it, or it
was very fluid. I felt like, I felt like it ranged nicely through a lot of areas. There weren't a lot of questions about what I would normally think of as sort of moral things, or the dimension of like how I relate to serving others, even though that came up in a lot of what I was saying. I don't know that it was explicitly probed, but I thought it was very comprehensive, very fluid, actually a lot of fun, but that's partly just us hanging out.
Yeah, so actually that I didn't elaborate as much on sort of the existential moral value virtue. It's a little underdeveloped in general, and I missed a few of those terms. So I'm glad you picked that up. For people that are sort of following in relationship to you talk, essentially what guides this is the 5th, 6th, and 7th branches on the tree of life behind me, which is character adaptation systems. Character adaptation systems places you in a developmental trajectory on the biophysiological, basically from conception through your physiological anatomy, which would be the biological line, your mental, behavioral, animal developmental line. What are you learning and developmentally after you're sort of born, and then age in arena relation? And then the sociocultural context line, all the way up from, okay, you're born in Canada, you're white, you're male, and then what's the meso level of your, sort of level of socioeconomic class, and then the micro relational level, the actual systems, and then dyadic relations and triadic relations you find yourself in: family of origin, peers, romantic partners, and then current context. And then you anchor that into the 5 systems of adaptation. So I'm tracking your habit systems, which are modal action patterns procedurally that then get ingrained into the normal patterns of living, and then that have to regulate the biology: sleep, eating, exercise, sex, substance, okay, and a lifestyle pattern. And then you're a mammal experiential system, okay? It's basically how you're perceiving, and in particular, how that perceives coming into your needs relative to your emotions. And that's really sort of the need emotion system, unless we have some reason to believe your perceptual system's off key, that we're really tracking that, okay? Then we come up to your primate system and run your relational dynamics, your attachment system, okay? Your competitive cooperative system, felt sense of known and seen, known and valued, and important others, and how you deal with self versus other tensions on the agreeableness dimension. With the others, we're doing extroversion, neuroticism. Okay? Then we come up to the person dimension in relationship to how do you justify to yourself, justify to others, manage that dimension, and what is the structure of your egoic identity, especially openness, conscientiousness, complexity, reflectiveness, capacity for metacognitive awareness in relationship to this, and these kinds of issues. So that's the systems of adaptation. And the argument, and then that's 5, and then the wheel of development. Okay, then says that these things are spokes. This would be like a Wilbur kind of idea, like what are the domains that are developing over time? So I'm tracking your trait dispositional tendencies. I'm tracking the cultivation of the identity from early childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. I'm tracking the values and virtues, which we underexplored in this particular thing. I'm tracking your ability sets, kind of in a multiple intelligence, kind of like we didn't touch on your music or athletic, but definitely general intelligence ability kinds of dimensions, and other kinds of issues like touch with nature, things like that. And then finally, the stuckness challenges, and then into DSM kind of pathology. Am I going to be tracking? And I didn't need to, but internalizing, somaticizing, externalizing, thought disorder kinds of issues, and other personality dynamic structures that would be then fundamentally indicative of long-standing problems of identity, relationship, and affect. And then all of that then is contextualized with the descriptive notion about what well-being is afforded by the nested model. So that's the mapping that's then brought to bear in relationship with guided all those questions.
So if there was an obvious, obvious area of concern, then you would address that with the person afterwards. But what would what would your general advice be about how to sit with, make use of, or what to do next after getting a well-being checkup? Like, what do I do with it now, other than
right? Well, I mean, basically, it's sort of like going into a physical. And so the psychological back to you is actually, at least in relationship to any kind of general judgment that I would have, it would sort of basically be like, keep doing what you're doing. Okay. It's like, it's clean bill of health. Your blood pressure is good. You're getting the right amount of exercise, So in this case, what am I really looking at? Okay. So I want to look at your embodiment up. I want to check your trait and dispositional structure in relationship to, hey, how healthy do you feel? How active, engaged do you feel? What's your extroversion versus neuroticism dispositionally? And then how are you adjusting and what kind of environmental stressors do you have? So your active, engaged, your positivity structure at the animal level is high. Your threat level is not zero, which I then would have concern about, but you have access to it. Then I want to see to what extent can you actually metabolize your emotion. Are you aware and attuned to especially the negative affect system, because it's easier to be aware, but are you generally aware and tuned to the affect system with nuance and capacity? And are you able to both feel it and then integrate it and narrate it for long term? Do you know what it's doing for you? And can you do it with nuance and differentiation? And notice, yes. Then I want to check the relational system. Does it feel known and valued? Is it fundamentally secure? Is there a balanced self and other? That you, as a sort of archetypal masculine in some ways, straight, super smart, really engaged, you're going to be somewhat agentic, self-oriented, but your capacity then for mentalizing, sympathizing, and being compassionate, and afford your capacity to feed back in relationship to that. That's where I would expect you to be. You delineated that optimally in relation, okay, with not a lot of felt sense of trauma and insecurity, although you could touch on times in which you're embarrassed, touch on times where you're vulnerable. You expressed a lot of, kind of self-reflective potential humility and confidence at the same time. Even when we opened up, you nuanced us in relation. And then that gets you into the person structure. So I want to see how conscientiousness and open you are. You're unbelievably open. Okay. So you're off the fucking charts on openness. All right. You're fucking exploring, you're wondering, you're the intellectual mastery and complexification, and you're able to do it effectively, it seems, without getting overwhelmed with a chaotic ontology you can't make any fucking sense of, or you're distributed. No, you're actually doing it and you're maintaining organization. I want to track your conscientiousness a little bit, because it's hard to maintain extremely high openness and be conscientious at the same time. Because if we think about this in terms of the chaos pressing versus order organizing, we do want some dialectic there, but you hold it. But there is sort of like, how much order are you willing to bring to bear and how much do you need? And does that put you in a little bit of vulnerability if you're not going to be industrious and organized in a socialized way? You get knocked off, become a hippie, and all of a sudden the shit hits the fan. Okay. So that's a slight dialectic, but you're conscious in relationship to it. And you can engage in achievement-oriented self-discipline. It's not like you're ADHD all over the fucking place. You can regulate and get shit done when you need it, and down-regulate some of this exploratory diffuseness when you need to be regulated. Okay. And then the issue of sort of like, do we see a lot of psychodynamic defense mechanisms, especially where mindfulness can't be brought to bear? No. We see basic awareness in relationship to that stuff. You've integrated. It's not like you don't, always need to tell people what's going on, or you're afraid of your defenses. You recognize them. You can be reflective about them. You've cultivated them in a particular kind of way. So those are all, sort of structural systems of adaptation, as far as I'm concerned, that are running pretty close to optimal. Anyone that would then bring in, hey, this is what you ought to be doing differently. Well, they have to be the idiographic individual who says, well, I really value that. And I have concerns about that. From a broad aggregate actuarial perspective that says, hey, are there indicators here that this guy's going to have long-term problems and vulnerabilities? No, I don't think that we have any, there's no real indicators along those lines. So at that level, you get a clean bill of health. And, I love me, God gives me fulfillment, and I'm on a good trajectory and all this other stuff. The one concern you have is where they're all going to die based on global civilization collapse. And all I can say is, yep, check that fucking box. And how to fix that? Check that fucking box too. You figure it out, let me know. But that's exactly where, to me, that's just an accurate realization of what the whole global situation would be, and who the fuck can see that and wouldn't have anxieties. Well, maybe a sociopath. I don't know. So that's my rundown.
The fantasy of the app. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's like, it's not going to help me that much. The suggestion part at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there were obvious areas, then it could offer
the most
corrective points.
Totally. So the most common problem, okay, so we think is internalizing. All right. So the most common psychological problem that then affords itself feedback in relation is the internalizing problems. What do they look like? People that are moderate to high to very high at trait neuroticism. That means they have a high negative affect system that's intense, reactive, difficult to soothe. They sit on that horse, okay? Often, both that's behavioral, genetic, and probably adverse childhood effects, and probably insecure attachment, all then feed into that. And then you stack a negative affect system, you embed it in a felt sense of not being seen, known, and valued. So now you're relationally vulnerable. Okay. And then you try to regulate it. And ultimately you get into the split between the private ego on self and the persona creates an internalized critic. Okay. A mindful list, reactive critic that's trying to control negative situations and negative feelings. And unfortunately, what it does is like brings water to a grease fire, and since it makes sense, it's going to try to control it, but it self-punishes, it avoids, it controls, it defends. And then all of a sudden you get all of this negative affect that isn't effectively to be metabolized in a coherent way. It isn't like, oh, what is this for? It's like, why the fuck are you doing this to me? So the ego gets super pissed at the system. All right. So that's what I'm looking at. And then does it lack understanding of what emotion is? Does it lack an emotional vocabulary? Does it lack acceptance capacities in relationship to that? Does it lack adaptive regulation? Because when they bring it on, it becomes dysregulated. And then the process of metacognitive reflection. Essentially, the calm MO flashlight says we got to figure out how to create a curious, accepting, loving, motivated toward valued states of being relation to negative situations and negative feelings. Because that bomb soothes the secondary negative reaction that completes the neurotic internalizing loop. So that's what I'm shining the light on in terms of what's the most basic diagnostics that I would actually run, and then run it in a way that they would then come online and basically be like, hey, we got to get this person into a 10 to 12 session psychotherapy coaching relation that affords them clarity about self-diagnosing triple negative neurotic looping and turning on a calm MO flashlight rather than bringing their self-critic, defensive, vulnerable, irritable self to this situation. So that's what you'd be really screening for. There's also thought disorder shit. There's personality disorder shit. There's externalizing substance use disorder shit. Somebody's just coming in for a checkup. You can flag them and say, hey, there's going to be some problems. Doing psychotherapy and fixing that. But that's in terms of from a health service system perspective. And believe me, of all the things, depression, anxiety, internalizing low self-esteem, and relationship fucking problems, that's not a small chunk. Of the human condition by any fucking stretch. So to be able to have sort of a basic frame of understanding the ontology of that, running diagnostics on that, and then affording the clear, lens on how we would ship that into a particular, self-determining, but relationally grounded and professionally guided structure of, that was a vision back when I believed in institutions. So there it is.
Well, this is fantastic, Gregg. Thanks for running through this experiment with me. And I hope anybody who attends to it, in whatever degree they attend to it, gets a richer, more inactive sense of how these ideas you've been working on come together in the real world.
Lovely. It's been a joy, and I get to know you better. And yeah, man, clean bill of psychological health. Go out there and keep doing what you're doing.